sort of a funny anecdote was that we did win this wonderful, what was it called, the Leontief Prize for advancing economic thought together. And when your daughter or son wins a prize, as some of you will know, but actually none of you know because you guys are like mainly teenagers here, you go, right? So my father was like, I'm going to come, see you win this prize. And the problem is that I was really looking forward to the day because Branko, as I can contest here, has this real fame in terms of someone who really understands inequality between countries, within countries, and I was dying to actually talk to him about stuff, right? The stuff that he's going to talk about tonight. But my dad and him just kept talking about football, soccer, calcio, and this guy knows everything, even of random teams like the one that my dad supports, which is Padova. I think it's Series B. And he named all these random teams. And so one thing I wanted to do before we get busy is to make sure he actually knows what he's talking about with soccer. So I have an Arsenal hat and scarf just to make sure. Because I wasn't sure.
With the others, I never tweet any preferences on teams.
Yeah. So the reason we invited him was one, so I could actually hear him talk about serious stuff, not just soccer. But because when he was talking about soccer, I never heard him actually support a particular team, I just thought we might as well solve that problem as well. So all you Arsenal supporters should be, unfortunately I don't hear any big cheers, so you guys are obviously Tottenham or something weird like that. Anyway. That's a big problem. Anyway, okay. So just really quickly, we were looking over his bio, which is too long, and trying to see which bitch I should say. So I'm just going to basically read off the whole thing because it's all quite impressive. So he's a visiting presidential professor at the Graduate Center of City University of New York and senior scholar at the Stone Center for Socioeconomic Inequality. He did tell me, by the way, something great for all you researchers out there, that he doesn't care about grants because grants actually affect what you do, and he wants to be a free thinker, so is not interested in getting research grants. But I think your chair is funded by someone called Mr. Stone. That's interesting. He obtained his PhD in economics in 1987 from the University of Belgrade with a dissertation on income inequality in Yugoslavia, which obviously he then expanded to global inequality, which he has served us all very well by going into such details about, again, within and between countries. He served as lead economist in the World Bank's research department for almost 20 years, leaving to write his seminal book on global income inequality called Worlds Apart in 2005. He was senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington between 2003 2005, and has held teaching appointments at the University of Maryland and Johns Hopkins University. And his new book, actually it's not his new book, new book is about to come out. His recent book called Global Inequality was awarded the Bruno Kreisky Prize for the best political book of 2016 and was translated into 12 languages. It addresses economic and political effects of globalization, including the concept of successive Kuznets waves of inequality, largely driven since the first industrial revolution by technology and globalization. In October 17, we won that joint funky prize where he completely dismissed me and only spoke to my father. And he is here to tell us both about his thinking about global inequality, which again, he really is a thought leader on worldwide. He has produced amazing data sets, which many scholars are using today. One on world income distribution between 1988 and 2008, which compares average incomes by ventile, both across time and across 120 countries. And also the Gini data set ALG, which covers the period 1948 to 2017 and includes 521 Gini coefficients from 201 countries. And this, I think, was the main source of his very funky elephant curve, which I'm sure he will tell you more about. So without further ado, but I should also say a big thanks to Branko, who's going to be teaching tomorrow in IIPP's new undergraduate module called Rethinking Capitalism, where he'll also be talking about his new book, which is coming out soon, called Capitalism Alone, published by Harvard University Press. That class, by the way, is quite nice because it's a 2-hour class. The first hour is a theoretician, a researcher like Branko, and the second half is usually a policymaker inside government or a practitioner of some type. So tomorrow we'll have someone from the Resolution Foundation, which is a foundation working a lot on inequality here. Anyway, so on behalf of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, just want to welcome you all. And Branko, please keep supporting Arsenal and give us your...
Thank you for this beautiful introduction. Thank you for this unexpected gift and very valuable gift that is produced where? China. So indeed, we will talk actually about China today. I will be talking today about the changes in the global income inequality, global income distribution, and what are their political consequences. Now, this is an extremely big topic, so I will not obviously have, I will not cover even maybe 10% of the topic, but I would actually like to give you an idea first what it is, and also to give some pointers as to not only things that I have written or other people have written, but I think also the things that you yourselves can actually contribute in the future. The reason is that I think it's a topic that has only started its own existence something like 15 years ago approximately. And the reason for that is first because before this globalization, to a large extent our thinking was very much part of what is called methodological nationalism. So, our thinking was within nation state. If you actually look at economics profession, the entire thinking was within nation state, and only there was international trade practically, but international trade was still thinking from the nation state how it interacts with the rest of the world. But with global inequality, we go further, and with other global topics like climate change and so on, we basically take the whole world, the whole globe, as a unit of analysis. And that's actually quite a big change. Now, that was a change ideologically, but it is also a change which was made possible with, these are the books actually, so okay, that's a little bit of an advertisement. But it was also a change that was made possible because of the data that we have. Actually, when I started working on the topic like 20 years ago, there was some data, but when I compared that with what exists today and what I believe would exist in 10 or 20 years, it's really marginal. It was really, we had very little. And the fact that we have now such data made it possible to actually work at a global level. And when you work on a global level, I often say that to my students, you are really basically moving from a two-dimensional world to a three-dimensional world. So many of the topics, many of the issues, I will mention some of them, to which you actually thought you actually basically had either the answers or at least you had the framework. When you put it in a three-dimensional framework, that original answer, which was derived from a two-dimensional, really becomes either not sufficient or wanting, or maybe not, at least there were some questions or skepticism about that. So what am I going to talk about today? I mean, I may not cover all the things that I actually hope to cover, but first of all, I would like to say, just as a reminder, what is very specific or special about the current period, essentially since the fall of the Berlin Wall, basically, is that we have, for the first time in history, we have only one social system in the world, and that system is called capitalism. And all the countries function on capitalist principles. In my book, Capitalism Alone, I actually discuss why I think China is a capitalist country, so I will not discuss it today. So if you have some doubts about that, keep your doubts to yourself, buy my book, and then these doubts would be dispelled. Or maybe you would have more doubts, but I don't want to go into that discussion, so just want to say that I'm aware that some people might not agree with that. The second point, which I think is obvious, is a rebalancing of economic power between Europe plus North America on the one hand and Asia. So now this is something which actually we read every day. This is not something new. But what is important to realize is that this rebalancing, and you would see how it is reflected in the inequality data, is really bringing the relative economic power of Asia versus, let's call it larger Europe, meaning what Angus Madison called Europe and its offshoots, meaning North America, to a situation where it existed in a year about, like, let's suppose, around the time of the Renaissance. You had developed parts at that time along the Pacific coast of China and also the Atlantic coast and Italy, obviously, all the way up to Scotland of Western Europe. And that's basically where we are going to in the next 30 or 40 years. So it has many implications. But one of the implications also is, of which I will talk a little bit later, is that it is essentially undoing, to a large extent, the effects of the first industrial revolution. because the effects of the first industrial revolution were to propel the West up to economic power, political and military, and actually to keep Asia at a stagnate, well, not that, I mean, Asia remained at an income level which it had for probably 500 years, or in some cases actually went down. So now what we are seeing is a reversal of that. It's not that actually Europe and Western world are going down, but in relative terms, of course, their position is being sort of reduced, or is falling compared to the position of Asia. So you will see actually how all of these long-term events are actually reflected in inequality data. Another thing which is very interesting is the emergence of the global middle class, or the median class. I call it median because it should not give you the impression that the global middle class is something which in the Western world is called the middle class, because these are people who are not as rich as obviously what many people in the West consider to be middle class. Now that leads to another set of issues, political issues, because we don't know what the emergence of a global middle class means. We know, or we actually believe to know, that national middle classes are good, I suppose, for democracy. They are good also for mass consumption. But what does global middle class mean in the absence of global governance? So it may be good because actually many people in the global middle class will consume similar things. But politically, it's not at all clear what it means. Moreover, as of course we know, that rise of the global middle class goes together with the hollowing out of the middle classes in the rich countries. So you have two, again, very different developments. You have a development which you can say is good, which means quote unquote good growth of the middle class of the world, with a development which is quote unquote bad, shrinkage of the middle classes in the rich world. Then I will talk about the past 25 years in the rich world, and then these political and philosophical issues, some of which I already mentioned. And, well, finally, if we ever get to that, maybe we'll get there when we have Q&A, it's what type of policies may be the policies that the rich world might wish to apply in the future to stop rising inequality. So how does it look? Oh, that was long run. Okay. How does it look in the long run? So this is global inequality, which in principle, and don't ask me how these numbers are derived because there are lots of assumptions behind, but this is the best that we can do currently. Global inequality is inequality in income. So I have to underline, it's in income, which means income, generally speaking, after taxation, and it's on a per capita basis. Per capita means that you take the income of a household, divide by the number of household members, and assign that income to every household member. And we can go with some big assumptions. We can go to practically to the end of the Napoleonic Wars. As you can see here, the numbers are from 1820. So what you notice there, and what I said before about the Industrial Revolution, is reflected in these numbers. You see a relatively high level of inequality, which, by the way, is displayed on the vertical axis, and it's measured in the Gini coefficient. And that Gini coefficient goes from 0, which is the theoretical possibility of everybody having the same income, to a number of 100, which is also another theoretical possibility of one person having the entire income of the world. Obviously, not a realistic possibility. And you can see it's actually pretty high, 55. By the way, when I say 55, to give you an idea, for example, UK inequality is about 35. So this is a much higher level of inequality that you would find in any individual country. So it starts with a high level of inequality, but then it actually keeps on rising for about 150 years. So this is what is actually mentioned here, Industrial Revolution and the rise of the West. What is behind that increase of inequality? It's relatively simple to kind of get a big, broad idea. It's the rise of the West and stagnation of India and China. There are many other things going on, but that's the basic idea. Because you're actually getting some people who are actually fairly numerous, but they are not hugely numerous, becoming richer and richer. You know, some of you who have sort of read Marxist literature know that by the 1870, for the first time, Marx and Engels started questioning whether actually British working class is becoming some kind of worker aristocracy. Because what the Industrial Revolution did, it actually really rose the boats, not equally, but rose the sort of incomes of many people in the most powerful or richest countries, including obviously the UK. So then there were some, obviously accidents along the road, like World War I and the Great Depression and World War II. But then we come in the latter part of the 20th century to a very high plateau of inequality. But then something happens around 1980s. What happens, you will see that in national income data is three big changes on the national level, but then I will translate them to the global level. It is Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the West and Deng Xiaoping in China. So after that point, within national inequalities in all the three large countries go up. By 1991, there was, of course, a big change in India, where you also start the rise of inequality. Around 1990, at the same time, you have the beginning of huge increase in inequality in Russia and Ukraine and elsewhere. So essentially, in the latter part of 1980s, we have an explosion of inequality practically in all major countries in the world. But what else happens, and that's actually what is reflected in the global data, is you have the beginning of the rise of China and later India and Vietnam and Indonesia and Thailand and Burma nowadays and so on. So what that happens with their growth rates, which are double or triple of the Western growth rates, and their ability, like the West was doing that in the 19th century, to pull up not only the very top, of course the top gains more, but to pull up the entire population, you have what is really a sort of a new development. The rise of Asia leads to a decline in global income inequality. So there you have this really very interesting bifurcation, this kind of an unusual combination of things, that national inequalities in all major countries are rising, but that global inequality is going down. Even when you account for the top 1% and everything else, that decline may become smaller, but there is no doubt, I think, that there is a decline. And then you have, of course, the rising of national inequalities that offset that decline to some extent, but they don't offset it fully. So you have two big forces in sort of terms of economics. One is the rise of national inequalities, be it because of policy, technological change, or globalization. And the second force is the force of economic convergence. And when you think about the future, you have to think, if you think about global inequality, about the global middle class, you have to, in your mind, decide how these two forces are going to work out. In the past, in the 19th century, they worked out for a while, and that's why inequality went up together, because there was a period of large divergence when the West became rich and India and China stayed where they were, and at the same time increasing income inequality in many of the advanced, or actually at that time obviously rising countries like the UK, probably France, Germany to the extent that we know, and the US. But now we have the two forces working against each other. Now the force of economic convergence has been actually more important than the force of rising within national inequalities. Now what else we can get from the long run data? We can technically divide, or sort of arithmetically decompose global inequality in two parts. In a part due to inequalities within nation states, which I call class, and part due to inequalities between nation states, where you assume, when you say the following question, when you ask the following question, how would be the inequality in the world if everybody within each country had the average income of that country? And the answer, as you can see here, is that the red component, which is the location component, was actually increasing because of the divergence over the last century and a half. But in the future, with the rise of Asia, and already now, we have that component shrinking. And we have the within national or class component going up. So again, if you project it in the future, we might have a situation that actually I sort of kind of project here, that towards the end of this century, we might have probably lower level of global inequality, but higher share of within national inequality than we have now, and lower share of between national inequality. So we might go back to a situation where the cleavage within nation states was as important as the cleavage between nation states. Now, why I'm actually mentioning Marx and Frantz Fanon here? Because Marx's view, as you know, was implicitly that it is actually the cleavage, the key cleavage is within each nation state, between, if you say, bourgeoisie and workers, between the rich and the poor. And that cleavage carries over through all nation states. What has happened in the 19th century and the 20th century was that the cleavage actually changed the position. The cleavage became between nation states. And that's very well reflected in Fanon's work. I think it's actually very interesting because practically the peak of inequality driven by location was around between 1960s and the 1980s. And it's not surprising then, when you look backwards, that actually the peak of interest in this kind of a split between the West and the rest was then. You know, there are many other, sort of quotes that I can have. For example, Mao Zedong, when he said the proletariat of the world is the third world and the bourgeoisie of the world is the first world. Well, that's exactly what you find in the data. So this was, it's not a simple decomposition. That decomposition has huge, I think, political import and political meaning. So just simply another illustration of the resurgent Asia, where I actually use, as I don't need to reread what you can read, when I use Chinese, Indian, and Indonesian GDP and compare it with the UK and the Netherlands. And of course, what you see there is around mid-1980s, late 1980s, you have a switch. So in other words, this was really what Paul Barak calls in a different context, I think it's actually la ère or l'année charnière. There was a basic period where actually everything else that we are now living through was incipiently created. And that period, as I said before, was the late 1980s, early 1990s. Now, how does it look when you go beyond the averages, when you actually juxtapose the distributions of China and the US? Of course, what you see there with the Chinese distribution gradually sort of moving closer to the American. Now, these are the two distributions. As you notice here in 2002, you have only about a quarter of the Chinese population within the range of the US income distribution. By 2013, you have, 70% of the Chinese population. So eventually what will happen is that something similar that you have, for example, in the EU 15. If you juxtapose, put like that on the same graph, French and German distribution, you really would not be able to tell which one is which, because the two distributions would look very much alike. It's not only that the mean is very similar, the distributions are very similar. So this is what is actually happening with the rise of China. Now, it has many implications, particularly for the Western countries. I'll come to one of them now. So first, let me just sort of remind you that in the long run, what happens to inequality is largely determined by convergence of income or divergence, which of course raises the issue of obviously Asia today, but raises the issue of Africa in the future. So maybe in the Q&A, somebody might ask me that question. I will not talk about Africa here because Africa had not had a major role in all these developments. But in the future, it will because of the rise of population in Africa. But in the medium term, what determines global inequality is obviously what happens to within national inequalities. Secondly, if there is a convergence. And thirdly, very importantly, if the convergence is of the large countries. If you have a convergence of Chad to the UK income, it really doesn't matter. But if you have a convergence of China on UK or the US, that it matters, simply because 1.4 billion people actually matter much more than 8 million or 10 million people. So that's the difference. Now, I also like to say that the past 25 years have actually witnessed, without any doubt, the greatest reshuffling of individual income positions from the Industrial Revolution until today. Now, what I mean by that is the following. Suppose that you have a stack of a pack of cards, and that I have your income. You tell me your income, I do all the calculation, and I put you in that international or global income distribution. So I put you somewhere, like suppose 70th percentile. What is happening with rise of Asia is that it's not, as you will see in a moment in the elephant graph and so on, it's not only that Asia and Asian countries create this global middle class and move. They're actually moving up the income distribution. And as you move up the income distribution, positionally, people who were actually at the bottom of Western income distributions fall. So even if their real income is still increasing at the rate, let's suppose 1%, 1.5%, their relative position in the world is going to shift downward. So, and particularly it's going to shift downward because you have large masses of people moving in. So what is actually interesting here for the rich countries, and I think it's not actually even thought much at all, is despite of what happens to income inequality within your nation state, you would have in about 20 or 30 years, in your nation state, which is currently advanced countries and rich countries, you would have people who actually belong to the 50th percentile in the world, 70th percentile, 80th percentile, and 100th percentile. And of course, everything in between. And this is an absolutely new evolution, new development for the West. Because since this data started actually being sort of collected or invented, exposed, the West has always had distributions, and I'll show you that in a minute, which were basically around, like, let me come to the, I'll go very quickly, I'll go back to them, but I want to go to show you where the Western median income is, and it's actually here. So whatever, and Western basically lowest income is there. So essentially, Western distributions and our entire discussion of inequality in the UK or the US and elsewhere is a discussion about the top 25% of the population in terms of income. But that, as I said, is going to change because even if this guy here, the blue guy who is now at the 70th plus percentile, even if he or she keeps on rising by 1 or 2%, he would be or she would be displaced, and it's already probably displaced as I speak, by the rise of incomes from large countries that are actually growing at 5, 6, or 8%. So it's a major change, which you might not think much because people don't think, well, am I the 50th percentile or not? But it is a change which actually, as I said, for the first time makes the Western countries' distributions not really fit in the top 25%. You know, when I say that also they are not in the top 25%, I have also to mention that there is another ambiguity that global inequality brings in. When we speak about this much reviled top 1%, it's very unclear who the top 1% is. Implicitly, because we are still thinking of nation state, we think of the top 1% within our countries. But if you think of global top 1%, then you have 12% of Americans who are part of that global top 1%. I think between 6 and 8% of people in the UK who are the, also global top 1%. So practical, and Germany and France and Japan, Singapore is, I think, the country, and Switzerland are the country with largest shares. I think Switzerland and Singapore have about 15% of people in those countries being the global top 1%. So essentially, you can say that the top decile in the UK, more or less, of the top ventile is really part of the global top 1%. So even, as I said, the meaning of the top 1% becomes a little bit shakier. So I will not repeat because you can see that what are all these different numbers. What do they mean? This is, of course, the global income distribution. I drew here the poverty line. This is the famous absolute poverty line of the World Bank, which lives below that line about 10% of the population. Then you have global median, then global mean, and so on. There are many other implications that you have from this graph. Let me mention one of them, because I've got many more slides, so I will not, and not much time, actually. If you think that I had a discussion on the internet, and by the way, you should also read my blog. It's called Global Inequality. It's very easy to find. A discussion about climate change and things like that. There is this belief, which is really inaccurate, that you somehow can actually bring everybody who is relatively poor and the middle class, global middle class, and all these people who have 2,100 PPP dollars per year, that you can somehow bring them to the median Western income within the envelope that we currently have of the world GDP. Well, you just cannot do that, simply because if they were to come to the median Western level, or even to the sort of a bottom decile Western level, you would need to actually have an envelope which is 3 times as large, unless you want actually to have everybody who is rich in the Western world lose 2/3 of their income. So basically, that's the trade-off, and people have to realize when we are talking about having keeping the world GDP envelope fixed, that either implies and not reducing and reducing poverty. These two things are actually in conflict, and when you look at the numbers which have world sort of distribution, then you realize that that conflict is a very real one. So you might want still to say, okay, I really want this envelope not to change a bit. But then you have to actually accept the implication of that, which is then there are 2 possibilities. Either people who are very poor now are condemned to remain poor forever, or you're going to affect massive redistribution that really was like really the equivalent of Khmer Rouge in the UK or the US. So you have to choose. But there is a choice to be made on that. So let me then go. This is basically the same graph which actually highlights this emerging global middle class. And as you can see, for the first time, I think, in history, since at least we have the data on 2 centuries, we have a sort of expansion of the middle. And my data are kind of already obsolete. That middle is certainly thicker now than it was in 2011. It's a long story why the numbers are not updated, but basically it is certainly the case with still rising incomes in Asia at the rates of India now is at 10%, China at 6%. People are actually very funny because they have a Financial Times articles about China slowing down. But 6% or 6.5 is a phenomenal rate of growth. I mean, when you see 6.5 repeated for like 40 years, it just totally transforms the world and obviously transforms the country itself. So now this is the elephant graph. Many of you, let me just I've never done this before, first time ever, but there is always first time for it. How many have seen this elephant graph? Because if you have mostly seen it, I'm going to skip it. Okay. So you know what it means. It means on the vertical axis, the rise of real incomes. On the horizontal axis, you just list people by their income position from the poorest in the world to the richest. And you have basically 3 points, very simple. You have the rise of Asia in the middle, which actually would move now further to the right. You have absence of growth of the lower parts of the income distributions of the rich world, and you have sort of growth of the top 1%. So these points A, B, and C, they are there forever. I mean, you can see 2011, that's the same story. It's less now strong towards the top because that top has really suffered from the global financial crisis. But these 3 points are very important. Now, people ask me, so what will happen with this? Well, it's not going to remain an elephant. It will become a different animal because with the rise of China, as I said, this is not an immovable picture because as people now move in, they would displace people who were there at the position of the lower middle classes in the rich world. So you would actually have a different shape, what is called global incidence curve. So that shape, which is absolutely crucial, and that's why, of course, I mentioned this was made in China, because what that shape, let me go back to this graph. What it illustrates is that from the point of view of policymaker in the Western countries, and I'm not saying that either of these 2 policies is better than the other, but it's very clear that you have 2 policies. If you say, well, okay, these are these guys who are my middle class, lower middle class, they have not seen any growth in income, what do I do? You have one policy that you say, okay, I'm going to go after those guys who are really at the top there. Who are they? Well, they're the Chinese and other Asians who have done very well. So this is this conflict. So in other words, you say, well, if my middle class has really been impoverished because of outsourcing, because of imports, because of the rise of Asia, I would actually try to do something so that Asia's growth slows down and I get some advantage on my side. And essentially, this is what explains, I think, Trump's policies and the trade wars. Another possibility is you say, well, there are many other good sides of globalization, so I'm not going to go in that direction. I would go after my own national top 1%. So that's the other policy. Well, nobody has tried that other policy. But this is really basically the options that you have. And then I think what the graph does is actually very strongly highlights that these are the two policy choices. So maybe you should actually combine them. And I actually think that maybe some people are trying to combine them because there is the going after Asia is also going after migration because it's basically the same idea. So you might actually combine that, but I think it is clearly the options are very, so I think clearly sort of shown or in the graph. However, that graph, which is all done in relative terms, is absolutely crucial, and of course I've used it a lot and people have reproduced it and so on. However, that graph looks differently when you look at the gains in absolute amounts. When you say, okay, the world has become richer by 100, where did this 100 go to? And actually what then you find is that the gains really, although they were strong in the middle, but they were strong in relative terms, but not in absolute terms. And the reason for that is that if you have 5% growth at the very top and 5% growth in the global median, the top and the median are so vastly different in absolute amounts that obviously 5% at the top is going to translate into much greater absolute gain. And when you look at who actually really gain from globalization in absolute terms, of course, the concentration of the gain is at the top. Now, that does not mean, and we don't have the data, these are not necessarily the same people. You know, we are just saying that people whoever was there at the top 5% or top 1% gain, as you can see here, the top 1% gain 20% of the additional income of the world produced between 1988 and 2011 in this case. But it doesn't mean necessarily we don't know. We just know that the top gain. But could it be that the person who was not in the top moved there? Very likely. But obviously we don't have longitudinal data for the world. We actually have trouble having longitudinal data for individual countries, much less for the world. Now, somebody asked me, so, okay, but was this elephant and this particular shape very specific to today? And again, these are really much weaker data that we have for the previous periods, but I tried with whatever data we had to calculate that. And as you can see, well, whatever we obtained, it didn't look the same. Actually, the growth rate, which is actually what is growth incidence curve, the growth rate was more or less equal across the parts of the distribution. So that kept the global Gini about unchanged. Remember that in the first graph that I've shown tonight was that actually you had that period between 1960s all the way to 1990s of more or less stable global inequality. Stable global inequality translates in more or less equal relative gains, percentage terms gains, for everybody along the income distribution. So this globalization is very specific. There is something different there. And of course, we see that it's different because there was a huge reallocation of economic power between countries and between individuals. So I think actually where am I now? I know where I'm in my slides, but in terms of my time, 5 minutes. I thought it was 9. 9. Okay. Oh, no, 5. You're right, actually. 5. So I want to show you one cool graph, which actually highlights how you can think of distributions in that global context. So what you have here is you have percentile. Let me show you the first country, and I will explain to you this. You have percentile of countries' income distribution of horizontal axis and percentile of global income distribution on the vertical axis. So let's suppose that I ask you, again, as I asked before, I ask you what is your income. I do all these calculations, which I don't show you. I do this behind the desk, you know, so I just pull out the number. And I say, OK, let's suppose you're at the 50% of let's suppose that the US and the UK are the same. So you're the 50th percentile of the UK income distribution. And then I ask a question. So where do you think you would be in the global income distribution? Because you're a smart person, you say, well, I know that the UK is a rich country, so I cannot be in the global income distribution, the 50th percentile. I have to be above. And then what you see here is that if you draw the line at 50 and go all the way to that position on the vertical axis, you discover that you are at the 88th percentile in the world. And then if you are the 75th percentile in the UK, you discover that you are at the 92nd percentile in the world, and so forth and so forth. And only the poorest people, and this is because US has unusually many poor people compared to other Western countries, actually end up at the 50th percentile. But normally they don't. As I said before, normally Western countries start at the 70th percentile and just go above that. Then if I use income data, which actually, India has also consumption data that are generally considered to be underestimating actual, income or consumption of people in India, but this is income data. You do the same thing for India. And this is the curve that you get. The person with the median income in India would be at the 20th percentile in the world, and so forth. And then, of course, at the very top, you have people who are at 90 plus, and even people who are at the top percentile. Now, I'm cheating here a little bit in a graph because I should have divided India in slices, which are exactly like slices in the US, because each slice in India is worth 14 million people. Each slice in the US is worth 3 million. So if I were to divide India further, then I would, of course, have some Indians at the top 1%, maybe 3 million, maybe more. Now, what is this country? It's kind of an interesting country because you have poor people, as you have seen at the 20th percentile. You have reasonable middle class because people who are the 50th percentile in that country are at the 60th percentile in the world, and you have top 1%. And it's a big country. And it's not a country. Because it's that country. It's China urban. And how does it compare with China rural? This is China rural. So China is de facto like two countries. One country which is really China urban, which as you can see, it's now really acquiring all the characteristics of sort of advanced, fairly rich country. And since our data are permanently behind actual reality, and China is developing so fast, and India too, we are permanently underestimating actually the position of China rural, urban in particular, but also probably rural. As you can see, rural also has people who are actually below the 10th percentile in the world. And then this gives you an idea, what is that country? Well, that country is even more extreme than China urban because it has really very, very poor people. It has significant middle class, and it has noticed that quite a lot of people are at the 80th percentile and so on, and it does have also the top 1%. And this is, of course, Brazil. I could have South Africa. These are the countries that really mimic the world. So it's basically they are actually sort of, if you take the world and those countries come closest to the global income distribution. So when I've shown you this, it's actually, as I said, cool because it does not focus anymore on what is the mean income of China versus the mean income of the US. It shows you the entire distribution. It has many nice applications. This is the application that I developed when I went to the Danish office that does foreign aid, because they were very concerned whether their foreign aid is actually reaching the right people. And I said to them, that was when I was in the World Bank, it really doesn't matter. You can just drop this foreign aid wherever you want in Africa. Don't even think about to whom you want to give it. Just drop it from the airplane or any other way that you wish, because there is no way that there is a regressive transfer. Because Denmark and Norway, I actually use this in the Norway office too, is so much richer that not only the median taxpayer, but even if the tax were really taken from some very poor Norwegian, that tax cannot go unless the president of Madagascar himself takes all this money in his pocket. It just cannot go to somebody who is poorer than a person in Norway or Denmark. So you actually, particularly when you take this striking difference between Northern European rich countries with fairly equal distribution, and then you have African countries which may not have equal distribution, but they don't have sufficient number of people who are in the top 1% that actually even overlap with the poorest Norwegian. So that's the thing. Actually, I can actually slice maybe all this Madagascar population into 0.1%. You would still not find sufficient number. You might find 25 people or maybe 200 people or maybe 400, but you're not going to find sufficient number of them who are poorer. Well, I think I should actually, let me just see, maybe just 2 more slides and I'll stop. These are all well-known slides, so I will skip them. I will say very briefly something. What happened in the rich world is something that I already mentioned. You had the shrinkage of the middle class. The shrinkage of the middle class here is shown on the Luxembourg income study data. This is actually one of my affiliations, list data. And then you basically see it on the data before taxation and transfers. And when people say the US, obviously US has been, of course, what is actually nice about the US data is that they are more extreme version of everything else that has happened elsewhere. So that's actually very nice to study because it's more extreme. But basically, the story is not that different. And let me show you that the story is not that different, because if you use the same definition of the middle class, and I will not go into that definition because there are many, but let's suppose this one is reasonable, you actually have the shrinkage of the middle class in all the Western countries. And that shrinkage of the middle class has implications, as I mentioned before, whether you talk about democracy, so-called populism, whatever else. But also, it has implications, and that's why I was actually first time when I did this work contacted, and then actually they continued contacting other people by companies that produce goods like Louis Vuitton and other, fancy companies, because they're really interested to find out where the rich people live. What is the implication? Because if you have the shrinkage of the middle class, let's look at the US, where now you have 27% of the population who are middle class. Not only there are fewer of them now compared to 20 or 30 years ago, but their relative income to the mean has shrunk. So if you're a clever guy producing something, you say, well, why should I actually produce things for them when that market is shrinking? I should rather produce things that are used by top 5% because they're actually having more and more money. So it's actually what is happening is that the shrinkage of the market in the middle is double shrinkage. It's the shrinkage of the number of people in the middle and the shrinkage of their relative income relative to the mean. And that consequently, of course, makes the market more narrow. Okay, final thing, I have to show you China. This is the increase of inequality in China and stabilization to the extent that we know it towards the very like last 10 to 15 years. And I will stop with this point, which is actually from a new work that I just mentioned to Mariana, which I'm very excited about. It's the work on Chinese data. Long story, what they come from, and so on. It's unpublished, but this is what I called embourgeoisement of China. Huge change in the top 5%. As you can see here, or maybe you cannot see because you cannot read, but believe me that this is true, or at least it's true according to the data. The top 5% in China, which was composed of government officials and workers and so on in 1988, has now totally been changed. It's composed of capitalists, essentially 2/3 capitalists and owners of enterprises, entrepreneurs, and so on, and professionals. So it's a really dramatic change. So as we have had a dramatic change in the US, we had a different type of dramatic change in China. And since it's actually forthcoming work, I would actually stop here, and then we'll start with the questions. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to take, what's the expression, chair's prerogative, just to ask a first question while everyone's preparing theirs. And when we go to the floor, I'd say we do 3 at a time, because we have a full 40 minutes, so it'd be good to get as many as possible. Do you need a pen and a paper, or are you good with memory?
No, just remember.
Really? Wow, okay, you're better than me. So just 2 quick ones. One is, just in terms of the China urban, China rural, is that, how similar is that to what's actually happening in many Western countries where the divergence of incomes, you can really see it at the postcode level? Much more than, so in the US, North and South have actually converged, but at the postcode level, so the New York metropolitan region, for example, massive divergence. If you can say something about that. And secondly, the Norway, Madagascar, that I get. I think what kind of depresses me a bit, given everything we do in the Institute, is we look a lot at heterogeneity also within sort of Western countries, both in terms of corporate governance, so very different behavior of companies in terms of the degree, for example, that they reinvest profits into areas like human capital, R&D, versus things like share buybacks, but also very, very different policies, some very ineffectual, some regressive, some progressive. I didn't get a sense of that real kind of diversity within the West, within countries, because it kind of seemed at the end that you were saying it almost doesn't matter. They have the same levels of middle class. And I just didn't get a sense of when does policy matter and when does corporate behavior, so how the private sector behaves, matter.
Okay, the first question is a very simple one because I don't have an answer. So I have to say I don't know. But it's actually, obviously must be true because what we have seen a lot, particularly now, with studies of electoral behavior in many countries. I will avoid using the names that everybody, was it 5-letter word and 6-letter word? I'm not going to use them. Clearly people have, of course, argued that there is like large differences in income and so on. We do have the data, and obviously the data exists, but I don't know them. You know, for the UK and the US, for example, for Germany. I know for the US in the long term, what has happened is that you have the convergence of states. You know, the difference between the top states like Massachusetts and the others and by income and the bottom states, which used to be in the South, has now really really shrunk over the last 50 years. But of course, what has happened, actually, Jamie Goldberg has a nice paper, several papers on that. What has happened, as you alluded to, is really the metropolitan areas. I think he actually has 7 of them. It's obviously Manhattan, San Francisco, San Jose, Washington County, King County in Washington State, and Washington, D.C., and with the 2 counties, I forget which ones, really explains 1/2 of the increase in U.S. inequality. And of course, Jamie very interestingly links that to 3 developments, one Silicon Valley, another financial sector like New York, and the third, which is also very interesting, is wars. That's very good, actually, if you're in Washington, because they actually have lots of lobbyists who come and then become richer, and then, you know, schools get better, and then the restaurants actually do much better business. So this is, you know, what has happened in the US. We essentially had this kind of a polarization, a geographic polarization, and I think probably in other countries as well. I know from Eastern Europe that actually everybody writes that big cities like Prague, Budapest, and so on has basically sucked in everybody. You know, and of course many people have left, but really big cities have become much richer. On the other, yes, from this global perspective, for me, I have to say that actually, yes, there are differences in policies, but they are not, they are important if you kind of stay within. Let me just show, for example, US. Okay, let me show.
Find the question, because you said in the beginning that Thatcherism and Reaganism did matter. Now, that's like a big macroeconomic point. It's kind of, you know, aggregate point. But then within the West, there was very different policies. There wasn't Reaganism everywhere. There wasn't then the effect of, say, shareholder value everywhere. So I don't see how you can say that, because on the one hand, you said policies mattered. It explained part of your curve. But then the diversity between the countries was massive at that level. I mean, there's data on that. You know, how does it not show up?
Probably, this is from obviously your area, and you know it much better. But I'm not actually convinced that there was such a huge diversity in Western policies. Because when I go back, Mitterrand tried in 1980 to do different things. Well, he eventually couldn't. So he basically followed the Thatcher, you know, neoliberal script. And that neoliberal script, and with Germany was with Schroeder, in Spain was with González. I just see that neoliberal script to be very strong in basically all Western countries. And this graph shows that the red line is it's market income, which is pre-taxation and pre-social transfers. And when the red line goes from left to right, you have an increase in inequality. And practically everywhere, that's OECD data show that you have that. Now, behind that, and that's of course your area, there may be different things sort of playing out, but when I look at inequality, I see the differences. You know, Germany is not the US, but, you know, it seems to me similar. But, you know, I may be wrong.
So let's open up and we'll do 3 questions at a time. Let's just, I'm going to go by the room, left to right. So first here, then we'll have one in the middle.
Thank you. I just wanted to see how you rate my country, Russia, in your hierarchy, because the perception of Russian people that they are very, very rich. But if you look from inside the country, there are a lot of very poor and below the poverty level. So do you have an opinion?
Okay. In the back there.
So my name is Eva, and I'm actually from LSE. So, well, my question was related to what you were saying about the importance of class and location, and the last graph that you showed about the changes in China. And I was wondering what your opinion is on how this will be affected by climate change and sort of shifting away from fossil fuel industries, and whether there will be a change in the structure and whether projections can actually really account for it at this point in time.
The first one on Russia. I actually had in that graph that I showed you, I had Russia there, but it became too busy, the graph, so I dropped Russia. But basically, Russia in the global income distribution looks very much like urban China. It's actually very interesting, and of course people always question, but you can question Chinese data as well, but people question Russian data, and I work with Russian data. But Russian data, the official data, and they show like the top 1% in Russia being the top global 1%, and the bottom is something like 40th percentile. So it really looks very much like China is there. I actually presented that in Moscow in January, so it looks very much like Chinese distribution. On the second question, I already alluded to that when I talked about the fact that you have the GDP envelope. So I don't know much about that, and I have no idea how the climate change and what will happen would affect global income distribution. One thing that I do know is that when you look at the CO2 emissions, and there were some papers done on that, you probably know them, is that actually they're very heavily concentrated among the rich people. So I think that our current debate, which is really centered US versus China or India or whatever, is again within that framework, old-fashioned framework, which I understand because these are nations that kind of negotiate. But in reality, if you look at who are the emitters of CO2, it's really the rich people, because elasticity of emissions is around 1 with relation to income. So that means essentially if it is around 1, that means that that income inequality of Gini of 70 is totally reflected in income inequality of emissions. So that's for inequality. But what will happen in the future, I don't know. And actually, I don't know much about that area, I have to say.
Okay, thanks very much. So the value of land in the UK, I own a house. It's now much more expensive than I could ever afford to have bought when I bought it. And there's an intergenerational issue going on. How does the intergenerational play into this?
China's had very particular economic policies that differ from the policies that were implemented in most of the developing countries, especially from the 80s onward.
I'm sorry, who differs? What country? What is the first word that you said? Germany.
China.
China.
Yes.
Okay.
To what extent do you think that differences in policies will affect the outcomes of the developing countries in their income distribution and their, the position they end up having in relative with other countries of the world?
Just turning to the policy side, the graph that you just showed with the arrows, pre-tax and post-tax inequality, what does that tell us about policy and the tax hype that is going on right now with AOC in America and all over the world, that the left is really focusing on taxes again? That basically shows us that pre-distributive inequalities has grown more than inequality based on taxes, right?
Okay, so you guys are really tough because of most of the questions that you ask, I don't have an answer. So that applies to your question. Because these are the income data. So the fact that, of course, your wealth is larger now, it can only translate in the case of housing. It can be, and that's a big if, because depending on different countries, because in principle, they should include the imputed value of the housing services. So if your house becomes worth £500,000 and it was worth 250,000 before, then the imputed value of housing services should be increased because presumably it reflects larger self-payment, as it were, of tenancy. But that's how it will, because it's not wealth data, so it's actually income data. So that's on the first question. On the second question, on who was that to ask me? On China, you should buy my new book. Because Capitalism Alone, because actually I spent quite a lot of time on China, and I think what will happen, and what is happening, is that the China, what I call political capitalism of China, provides an alternative way of organizing society and organizing economic life, and that alternative way is imitated by quite a few countries, and potentially might be imitated by others, on the assumption that China is interested in exporting that system. So I do think that actually in the future there would be, and there is already now, competition between the two systems. One is what they call the liberal capitalist system, or meritocratic, which has these features that I'm not going to, that you can read. And the other is the Chinese, which has other features, like inherent corruption, for example, but also possibly more efficient administration and so on. So I think it would influence the future behavior of developing countries. And the third, this is that graph. Let me show this graph. What is interesting in this graph is that, it doesn't want, oh, here it is. The red line goes up everywhere. That's before taxes and before social transfers. But the blue line, in some cases, doesn't go very much up because precisely the taxes and transfers have been able, to some extent, offset the rise of the red line. But you don't see anywhere, with exception, is there an exception? There was actually Ireland was an exception, that the blue line went down. It's essentially the blue line goes up everywhere. So yes, does policy matter? Yes, it matters because it actually modifies, reduces the strength of the red line, which is essentially driven by technological change, globalization, and so on. But I must say I've become, and that maybe puts me in a different camp, but I've really become somewhat skeptical of the ability of, within the current framework, of the policies, and especially of taxation, to really make a dramatic change. So I've become, actually in some of my talks, but then I dropped them sometimes, I put the title, the impotence of economic policy. And it's not because we don't know what policies would work. It's just because the framework of globalization really limits the ability of the governments to do policies that we know would reduce inequality. That does not mean that we cannot do anything, but I think it's actually much harder, and that's why my policy recommendations are going after changes in the distribution of assets, including education and financial capital, that would reduce the increase of this red line. So let's put it like simply, I've really become skeptic about the ability of the blue line to do the job. And I say, because I'm a skeptic on that, then let's try to make this red line go up less than it's now. And for that, you need essentially, to just conclude with that, essentially much more evenly distributed education, and especially education from top places where actually carry the rent afterwards, and much greater equality of financial assets. Because people really forget that financial assets, Gini, is 90-90. So in all Western countries, it's about that. So that's something which is actually, I think, forgotten.
Can I just ask you to address one thing that Alan mentioned? Because otherwise it's too easy to say that Piketty talks about wealth and you talk about income, and they're kind of related but separate. It seems that in a country, or in countries where you've had stagnant incomes, right, and you have the income data, there has been pressure then just to retain existing living standards to take out increasing amount of private debt, which then has actually fueled property prices, assets, and that also has created the kind of rent that people like Josh have written about, and wealth inequality. So have you tried to link the two, this more dynamic analysis?
I have an article which I can show you because it is documented in the internet, that was written honestly before anybody else on that particular link. Because since I've been working on inequality, it was total no-brainer to me that what was, and I'm not a macroeconomist, so then I actually didn't write about that anymore. But it was very clear that when you have stagnant incomes of the middle class, and you had huge incentive for the financial sector to actually place extra money from the rich people, and you had a huge incentive from the middle class that didn't see any increase in incomes to borrow. And then you had W. Bush, who said that every family in the US should have a house. So it was very clear to me that it was really, because it was, but it was not very popular because it looked very much under-consumptionist. The economists had a sort of a inbuilt bias that everything that is under-consumptionist must be wrong. Keynes really fought against that, very strongly, but even he couldn't go all the way to that. But then, of course, now the situation has changed because you had Rangarajan's book, you have another book, I remember in a minute. But actually, that has a little bit changed. But anyway, so this is not my area, so it just seemed to me from somebody who studied inequality that it was very simple. and who actually likes John Hobson. So because Hobson, of course, highlighted the essentially higher marginal propensity to consume of the lower classes.
Okay, one all the way in the back there, one all the way back there, and then one all the way in the front here. Yeah.
Well, first, thank you for the talk. Really interesting. I would like you to reflect a bit more on this idea of middle class, because I think it's both appealing and can also be misleading in the sense of thinking that there can be a middle class. According to the data, you could say, okay, there might be. But in terms of class analysis and identity, I think that it's very troublesome for countries, especially countries like Chile, for example, that are really in the middle class. But what do you mean by saying there could be a middle class among the global income distribution? I think that is a trap that could lead us finally to the triumph of the Trumps, the Bolsonaros like. So what do you think about this? Because we're in the middle of China, the Nordic social democracies, but what do you think by that?
Thanks very much. I'm a PhD student in the law faculty here. So in kind of in-country inequality has been spoken a lot about with relation to market power and market concentration by kind of Stiglitz, Krugman, Jean Tirole, and kind of linked to this stock buyback idea. How do you think that transposes onto the inter-country dynamics where you've got these kind of large transnational financialized firms dominating the world economy?
All good? Hi, Branko. Thanks a lot for your talk. We had some correspondence over email. I'm Max from Institute of Inequalities of LSE. Yes. Good to see you in person. Quick question on the elephant curve, and it's kind of related to the value of everything. The book that you've written that got the prize, and congratulations. Just, you know, the lower middle class in the US, they seem like the losers of globalization in terms of income, but you allude in your book to the fact that the standard of their life has changed because of the technological progress, you know, the adoption of washing machines and flat screen TVs and all those things. Just wondering if we should be trying to take account of that, or do we just keep measuring that in income terms? Thank you.
Okay, well, on the middle class question, okay, let me just say something to Mariana. You know, look at these countries. This is the Gini of the capital income and Gini of labor income. Do they look very different to you? You know, the facts is that really rich Western countries have fairly similar structures. And there are differences, of course, but you know, if you look at the distribution and who owns like financial capital, like in US, actually you have the top 10% owning, 10% of the financial owners own 92% of financial assets. Essentially, countries are owned by 10% of people, excluding housing. So when you include housing, then of course it becomes different. But financial assets like by the top 10%. And it's actually true in practically all countries. My counter example, the only one that I could come up with is Taiwan, where actually distribution of capital income or capital assets is less. But everything else, because for the other countries we don't have actually the data, but for the Western countries we do. So no, but then going back to the middle class, I'm not quite sure I understood the question. You know, I'm working in a very sort of very income-driven approach. I'm not discussing here, does the middle class have one way of life, another way of life? Is it educated? Do they feel they like this thing or they don't like? I actually take it as an income. That's one variable, but it's a very important variable, and that's how I define it. Because I cannot do global stuff with 10 different variables. Actually, we now actually are moving, hopefully, to possibly for the world put two variables together, which is income and education, with education levels linked to each decile of income, for example. Or actually having even better, having joint distribution of income and education. But if you work with the world, we'll have in my opinion, you have to use that. Now, if that would lead us in this way, one wrong way, I didn't understand where it would lead us, but this is actually the facts of the data. We are driven by the data. Then I remember your question. I'm sorry, so see, I should have written down. The second question was that was global. Well, easy. It's not reflected. I don't know how it would be because you actually work here with household data. I don't know if that household member who is rich is actually rich because he owns shares in Apple, and Apple is actually able to sell, to actually create global value chain. So it's not something that I have in the data. So I can speculate, but you don't need to hear my speculation because it's not better than anybody else's in this room. And the last question was on how should we include other amenities. I think it's a very good question. Actually, it's a very fundamental question because there are many things that in relative prices have become cheaper. Many household goods. You know, I'm actually now old enough that I remember how things were like 50 years ago. And I noticed, obviously, I think one thing which is, I think, very clear, and this was what Gordon does in his book about the US. Actually, we don't have that many new things, except for the information technology. But the quality of everything is better. You know, from coffee and beer to hot water and heating, and how the cars close, and whether they actually leak or not. That's much better. But do we have, other than IT, do we have something new? We don't have it. But it raises, of course, the issue also, the other side, the converse, is what do we do with housing, health, and education that have, of course, increased tremendously in relative terms. And that's the argument why the middle class in the US and probably in UK is suffering so much, because these three things, education, health, and housing, have gone up in price tremendously, which, of course, leads also to the question about housing and how it is reflected. But I think it's a more fundamental issue of accounting, essentially.
Yeah, thanks, Branko. I'm head of research at IIPP. I had two questions. The first one was just sort of critique of your elephant graph, or perhaps a critique of the way in which your elephant graph has been interpreted by some economists like Paul Krugman as sort of showing this, as illustrating the sort of Trump type argument. So you're probably aware the Resolution Foundation did some research where they basically took out China, took out Japan, and took out Russia, and you sort of completely flatten out the elephant. And right. But okay, let's just say you just take out China.
Page reply to that, you know. Okay. So it's not like.
Well, if you could give us a précis of those 10 pages, that would be great. And the other question I just had was on the you alluded to, you know, these changes to push back against globalization, financialization, and you talked about financial assets. We've had lots of talk with the Brexit debates about immigration, about trade, much less on global capital flows and capital controls, which, as somebody who worked at the World Bank, I assume you have a view on. I just wondered if that would be something you'd be interested to look at.
Thank you. Hello. I'm also from the LSE, and so you talked a bit about education now as one driver of increasing inequalities. I wanted to ask more about technological change and especially automation and artificial intelligence. How much did that contribute in the last years already to growing inequalities and maybe also to decreasing between countries inequalities, and how do you expect that like continues on translating in the future?
And then we'll have one last round, and because we had 3 men, the last round is 3 women. So there's 2 up there, but after, yeah.
I'm a student from IOE. I have 2 quick questions, short. First of all, what are the implications if you measure the Gini coefficient comparing the upper 10 percentile and the lower 10 percentile? The second would be, what would be the implication of measuring the income not on PPP measures, but just nominal?
Okay, so you know, that was of course my facetious answer to what you said about the Resolution Foundation. It's actually a good paper. There was nothing wrong in the calculations there. So it was, you know, it's accurate, it's fine. But the essential point, one should forget whether it is the, as I said, elephant or whatever. I showed a version that is very often shown where actually it's global incidence curve. If we have a different version where actually we keep the country deciles at the position where they were in 1988. And that, of course, is then different because you keep the third decile of China at this position, which was relatively low, and look what was the rate of growth. So the shape is somewhat different, and the top is less pronounced in that shape. But the point is really, and that's why I mentioned there are 3 points. 3 points are A, B, and C. A point is Asian countries, the population there being less rich in terms of income than the Western middle class and having higher growth rate. So you then have this point A very clearly there. Then you have a point B because you said, or we already said, that the Western middle class is richer, but it has very low growth rate. And the point C is that we know that inequalities in the Western countries, which are basically composing, you know, the top 1%, were high. So the relationship between the 3 points, you can pull countries in and out, but that relationship is there. So in that sense, I think that actually it is very difficult to undo that. On your second point was, no, I actually, you know, I don't have an opinion on that. I basically am taking the absence of capital controls as really part of globalization. If I were to start actually discussing, and in my book, the capital controls, then it puts me in an awkward position because I believe that we should treat, in principle, capital and labor the same. Because I'm in favor of free movement of labor, I cannot be in favor of capital controls. But I'm willing to modify the free movement of labor, it was a question that was asked before, because essentially the recipient countries are not willing to accept, you know, a free movement of labor. But I think as a principle, I think if we are in favor of globalization, as a principle, we should be in favor of the free movement of both capitals, and of both factors of production, capital and labor. So that's where my sort of, how should I say, prior is. Okay, so that's on that question. I remember yours. How it would have, I actually put these things here. Well, that's also in my book. I'm actually very skeptical of all this stuff about robotics, and not that I don't believe that they will be significant, but I think we always exaggerate. That goes back to, you know, Industrial Revolution. You read chapter 31, I believe, in Ricardo's Principles. It's really not different from what it is now. And actually, I think people use robotics because of this fear of anthropomorphism. It's like the robots who look like us, and they're going to come and steal our jobs. But in reality, that's a machine. You know, there is no difference whether we call that machine a robot of a Jenny, cotton Jenny, or whatever. It's introductional machinery. Now, the introductional machinery has a history of more than 2 centuries, starting obviously with the UK, essentially. And we know how it works. We know that actually there are losers, and we know that there are new jobs being produced. And because actually, when you live long enough, you actually know that there are jobs that you could never imagine existed. I can just reel you off all the jobs that I never imagined. And I just give you one example. I stopped. When my mother, during the wars in Yugoslavia, my mother came to the United States, spent most of the time there. And with any of my friends, she could never understand what these people were doing, because she was used to the normal jobs, like you're a teacher, or you're a shoemaker, or you're a professor, or you're a pharmacist. But all my friends were, you know, managing money, managing somebody else's money, doing something in a programming or something. So she had no idea, who are these people, what do they do? And that's exactly what we now cannot figure the future, because we say, well, this is the number of, this is a famous, of course, you know, the lump of labor fallacy. It's just our epistemological inability to do that, because if I knew what the new jobs would be, I would be very rich, because I would invest in them and become rich tomorrow. But because we cannot epistemologically do that, we cannot be rich. That's the only obstacle between us and wealth. And on the question, yes, actually inequality is much higher if you don't use PPPs. then that Gini of 70 plus goes over 80 and more. The shape of the rise of inequality is not very different, but the difference between PPP, calculated inequality, and exchange rate inequality is more or less constant. So that's what happens when you use exchange rates. And remind me the second always. If I use different measures, yes, I actually use tail coefficient. I can use the ratios. You know, the ratios are tricky because with the ratios, what is happening when you use the ratios? Global bottom of 10% really has not changed very much. So the global bottom stayed wherever it was before, and the global top has gone up. So that measure would give you much higher increase in inequality. If I were to use even more, if I were to use the global top 1% and the bottom 1%, the bottom 1% is today the same as 5 centuries ago. Nothing has changed, or maybe 10 centuries ago. But the top 1%, even in the last 30 years, has actually multiplied its incomes by a factor of maybe 3 or so, maybe 4 or more. So that, and of course, if you were to do wealth, that would actually explode, hugely. Yeah, the different measures, particularly these measures, would actually make inequality much higher.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I had a question about your inequality possibility frontier. This idea that sort of as the aggregate amount of wealth in the system balloons over the last 200-300 years, that it becomes possible to have that it not only becomes possible to have more inequality in the system because there's more aggregate wealth, but that it's also not impossible for the baseline to be increasing whilst inequality is increasing. So my question to you is that as the world gets increasingly rich, I mean at 3%, doubling the economy every 23 years, even if the very poorest get only a tiny fragment of that and it brings that up, do you project that at a certain point what we'll be talking about when we talk about inequality isn't poverty and isn't distress, but is the inequalities of power?
Well, it would now move me a lot to actually, maybe many people don't know what is inequality possibility frontier, but I would explain it in very simple terms. It's something that it occurred to me because I did also work in economic history. So it's basically what you realize when you work with very poor societies from today's perspective is that, actually it was in a paper on Byzantium. You realize that the amount of income which is there is relatively so low that if everybody was at a subsistence minimum, there is very little amount that remains for the top 1% to take. So the Gini coefficient, which takes everybody's income into account, is necessarily limited on the assumption that you don't let people die. It's a very interesting thing, actually, and that was developed further then because you see the Gini coefficient then becomes a very special case of inequality possibility frontier when people can have zero income and live on Earth, on air, basically. So essentially what happens, and that actually China is a very good example. China as it became richer, it has, of course, also increased inequality. But the distance between the current inequality and the inequality possibility frontier has increased. So in some sense, in that sense, China has become less unequal. The opposite example, which I actually used, was Russia under Yeltsin, where actually the inequality possibility frontier shrunk because income went down and the rich became richer. So then you basically have two negative developments. And what will happen in the future? Yes, as the world gets richer, then the inequality possibility frontier expands. And that means that we can tolerate higher level of inequality. Now, as you rightly said, and I've listed the systemic inequalities in liberal or meritocratic capitalism, and I unfortunately don't, this is a different lecture. There are some cool things like many of you with, homogamy, assortative mating, which is then another one, homoplutia, the fact that the capitalism now has both rich workers and rich capitalists in the same person. And of course, the number 5, the increasing control of the political process by the rich. So that, even if everything else goes well, that's, I think, one of the huge key arguments why we should be against high inequality, because it has to lead to political control. And when it leads to political control, that control is used in order to further increase the income of the top. So then you're really in a vicious circle, and that's what I call, like, basically you're tying the knot on political power and economic power. So that argument would remain regardless of whether you don't have poverty and regardless of whether inequality possibility frontier is much higher than your income, than your Gini.
Great. Well, thank you.
Okay. Thank you.